let's start. Number 10. The flesh strippers of the Long Barrow. The year is roughly 3700 BCE. On a low chalk ridge in what is now southern England, a small community gathers around a wooden mortuary house, little more than a roofed platform standing above the grass. A body lies on top of it, wrapped in nothing, exposed to the sky. Nobody buries it. Nobody burns it. Instead, the community simply walks away and lets the weather, the insects, and the crows do what burial normally prevents. Weeks pass, then months. When the family finally returns, they are not looking for a corpse. They are looking for bones, clean, pale, and ready to be sorted, stacked, and carried into a long earthen mound built specifically to receive them. History remembers this practice as excarnation, one of the strangest and most consistently misunderstood funerary customs anywhere in the prehistoric record. If you're fascinated by the darkest, strangest chapters of human history, subscribe now, because what comes next only gets worse. According to archaeologists working on Britain's early Neolithic Long Barrows, human remains recovered from sites like West Kennet and Wayland's Smithy show a pattern that could not have come from ordinary burial. Bones arrive disarticulated, sorted by type, femurs stacked with femurs, skulls grouped separately from jaws, with cut marks in places that only make sense if the flesh was removed long before the bones ever reached the tomb. For a long time, many assumed this fragmentation simply reflected disturbance, animals digging, later burials disrupting earlier ones, centuries of soil movement, scrambling what had once been intact skeletons. Surely no community would deliberately leave its own dead exposed to rot and scavengers before touching the bones at all. Then osteoarchaeologists began examining the bones themselves rather than simply their arrangement, and the picture became considerably harder to dismiss. Weathering patterns consistent with prolonged surface exposure, gnaw marks from foxes and birds, and the near-total absence of small hand and foot bones, exactly the elements scavengers would carry off first, all pointed toward the same conclusion. These were not disturbed graves. They were the deliberate second stage of a two-part funeral, one that treated a fresh corpse as something unfinished, something that had to be reduced to its purest form before it could properly join the ancestors. The flesh was not the person. The bones were, the logic, once reconstructed, reflects a genuinely different relationship with death than almost anything familiar today. In a farming community, without embalming, without stone tombs sealed the same day as death, decay was not something to be hidden as quickly as possible. It was a visible, months-long transformation the living were expected to witness and manage directly, moving bodies through mortuary houses, excarnation platforms, and finally, the Long Barrow itself in stages that mirrored the slow turning of a field from seed to harvest. Anthropologists studying comparable practices among more recent excarnating cultures note that this kind of exposure often carries no cruelty in it at all from the perspective of the people practicing it. It is simply believed to be the fastest, most respectful way to free a spirit trapped inside decaying tissue. What makes this practice so difficult for modern audiences to sit with is not really the mechanics. Plenty of cultures have handled bones separately from flesh, but the sheer visibility of the process. A body left in open view for the community to walk past for weeks defies almost every instinct modern burial customs are built to satisfy: the instinct to conceal, to seal away, to finish grieving on a fixed and predictable schedule. The Neolithic mind appears to have felt no such urgency. Death was allowed to take its time. The flesh strippers of the Long Barrow remind us that the discomfort we feel around a corpse is not a universal human constant. It is a preference, carefully built by culture, and 5,500 years ago, an entirely different culture built the opposite one. Number 9, the mummy makers who embalmed their babies first. The date is approximately 5050 BCE. Roughly 2,000 years before the first Egyptian pharaoh would ever be wrapped in linen. Along the arid coastline of what is now northern Chile, a small fishing family carries the body of an infant down to a workshop area near their settlement. There is no coffin waiting. Instead, skilled hands begin a process that will take days, carefully removing the skin, disassembling the small skeleton, reinforcing it from the inside with sticks and reeds, repacking the cavity with ash and plant fiber, and finally stretching the original skin, or sometimes a substitute made from sea lion hide, back over the reconstructed body like a sculptor finishing a statue. History remembers these people as the Chinchorro, and the mummies they built are the oldest deliberately preserved human remains ever discovered anywhere on Earth. According to bioarchaeologists who have studied thousands of Chinchorro burials along the Atacama coast, the practice began not with chiefs, priests, or the wealthy, the pattern almost every other mummification tradition follows, but overwhelmingly with children, infants, and even miscarried fetuses. For decades after the first Chinchorro mummies were cataloged in the early 20th century, researchers assumed they must represent an elite class, important individuals singled out for an honor too costly to extend to the wider community. Surely a labor-intensive, technically demanding process like this would have been reserved for people of status, exactly as it later would be in Egypt. Then closer statistical analysis of the burial population overturned that assumption entirely. The earliest and most elaborate Chinchorro mummies were disproportionately children, and researchers began connecting that pattern to something else showing up in the skeletal record: unusually high concentrations of arsenic in the local water supply, a naturally occurring contaminant in the Atacama's mountain streams that is strongly associated with elevated rates of miscarriage and infant mortality. A community losing children at devastating rates appears to have responded not by burying that grief quickly and moving on, but by building an entire technology around preserving it, refusing to let a small body disappear into ordinary decay at all. The technique itself evolved over centuries, cycling between distinct styles archaeologists now label black, red, and mud-coated mummies, each reflecting a different generation's approach to the same underlying goal: an artificial body built to outlast the original one. Mannequins were painted, given wigs made from human hair, and in some cases fitted with clay masks modeled to resemble a face. These were not hidden away in sealed tombs either. Evidence suggests some mummies were kept above ground for extended periods, displayed, and possibly moved or repositioned by the living, treated less like remains to be mourned once and more like family members who simply required a different kind of ongoing care. What makes the Chinchorro practice so hard to fully absorb is the inversion at its center. Modern instinct assumes elaborate preservation follows importance, that a pharaoh gets mummified because a pharaoh matters more than a fisherman's newborn. The Chinchorro record suggests something closer to the opposite motivation: a grief so acute and so common that ordinary families developed an extraordinary technology specifically to answer it. The mummy makers of the Atacama remind us that the most sophisticated rituals surrounding death do not always emerge from wealth or power. Sometimes they emerge from loss repeated so many times that a community simply refuses to let go of the bodies it could not keep alive. Number 8. The surgeons who drilled skulls while the patient still breathed. The setting is the high Andes, sometime across a span stretching from roughly 400 BCC well into the era of the Inca. A man lies on his side, fully conscious, while another person kneels over him holding an obsidian blade and a small bow drill. Slowly, carefully, a section of the skull is scraped, cut, and finally lifted away, exposing the dura mater beneath, the protective membrane covering the brain itself. There is no anesthesia in the modern sense. Though coca leaves and fermented beverages likely dulled some of the pain, there is no sterile field. And yet the patient, more often than most people assume, survives. History remembers this procedure as trepanation, and the Andes contain more surviving examples of it than anywhere else on the planet. According to the physical anthropologist John Verano, who has spent decades cataloging trepanned skulls from Peruvian archaeological collections, more than 800 examples have now been documented across Andean sites, spanning nearly 1,000 years of continuous practice. For a long time, this figure alone struck many outside the field as difficult to credit. Surely a procedure this invasive, performed with stone tools and no understanding of infection as modern medicine defines it, would have killed the vast majority of patients almost immediately. Then the bone itself provided the answer, because bone that has healed looks unmistakably different from bone that has not. Smooth, rounded edges around a trepanation opening indicate the patient lived for months or years afterward, long enough for new bone growth to close over the wound. When researchers systematically sorted the Andean sample by healing evidence, the survival rate for skulls from certain periods and regions reached remarkably high levels, in some samples exceeding an 80% success rate, a figure that in several later centuries actually surpassed the survival rate of battlefield trepanation performed by European surgeons during the American Civil War. Working with metal instruments and a basic germ theory the Andean healers never possessed, the reasons behind the procedure appear to have varied considerably. Some skulls show clear evidence of skull fractures nearby, suggesting the surgery followed traumatic head injuries, likely from the slingstones and war clubs common to Andean combat, performed to relieve pressure on a swelling brain in a manner not entirely dissimilar from a modern emergency craniotomy. Other cases show no trauma at all, hinting at treatments for chronic headaches, seizures, or conditions understood in purely spiritual terms, an attempt to release trapped pain or a malevolent presence believed to be lodged inside the skull. Andean healers appear to have refined their tools and techniques over generations, favoring scraping methods that removed bone gradually rather than aggressive cutting. A slower approach that dramatically reduced the risk of puncturing the membrane beneath. What makes Andean trepanation so difficult for a modern audience to fully process is not really the brutality of the procedure. Plenty of pre-modern medicine involved cutting into living bodies, but the sheer competence behind it. This was not blind superstition performed by people ignorant of the risks. Multiple trepan skulls show 2, 3, even 5 separate healed openings on the same individual, meaning some patients survived being operated on repeatedly across their lifetime and kept returning to the same practitioners. The surgeons who drilled skulls remind us that skill and technical mastery long predate anything resembling modern medicine, and that some of history's most successful operations were performed by hands working entirely, without the tools we now consider essential to survival. Number 7. The village that fed on its own neighbors. The date is approximately 5000 BCE, in the fertile farmland of what is now southwestern Germany. At a site near the modern village of Herxheim, members of the linear pottery culture, one of the first farming societies to spread across Neolithic Europe, gather at a series of enormous ditches encircling their settlement. Over what appears to have been a relatively short period, the remains of at least 500 individuals, men, women, and children, drawn not from a single household, but from communities scattered across a wide surrounding region, are processed, defleshed, and deposited into those ditches alongside broken pottery and animal bone. History remembers Herxheim as one of the largest and most disturbing mass mortality sites ever uncovered from Neolithic Europe. According to the bioarchaeologists Bruno Boulaston and Christian Meyer, who conducted the most detailed analysis of the Herxheim remains, the human bones recovered from the site bear cut marks, fracture patterns, and breakage consistent with deliberate processing for meat, not incidental damage from burial or later disturbance. For years after the initial excavation began in the 1990s, many archaeologists resisted that conclusion outright. Surely a peaceful early farming culture, known primarily for its distinctive pottery and settled agricultural life, would not have engaged in anything resembling large-scale cannibalism. Ritual defleshing without consumption, or a mass grave from an epidemic or massacre, seemed far more comfortable explanations. Then detailed comparison with animal butchery debris from the same period changed the conversation entirely. The human long bones at Herxheim had been broken in exactly the pattern associated with marrow extraction, the same technique applied to cattle and deer bones found nearby, cracked open along predictable fracture lines to access the nutrient-rich marrow inside. Skulls had been carefully modified into what researchers describe as skull cups, the base removed with practiced precision, a technique requiring real skill and almost certainly repeated practice to execute without shattering the surrounding bone. Isotope analysis of the victims further complicated the picture, revealing that many of the dead had grown up eating diets subtly different from the local population, suggesting people from multiple distant communities converged on Herxheim, whether willingly or not. In the final months before their remains ended up in its ditches, researchers remained divided on what exactly drove the event. whether Herxheim represents warfare between competing farming groups during a period of documented regional instability, a large-scale ritual feast tied to some belief system now lost entirely, or a combination of both, violence transformed afterward into ceremony. What the bone evidence makes difficult to dispute is the scale. This was not an isolated act of desperate survival cannibalism during famine. It was organized. It involved victims from a wide geographic catchment, and it unfolded across what appears to have been a sustained period rather than a single chaotic incident. What makes Herxheim so unsettling is the mismatch between what the culture is known for elsewhere, elegant spiral pottery, established farming villages, long-distance trade networks, and what its ditches ultimately revealed. Farming, it turns out, did not automatically bring the settled peacefulness later generations sometimes assume it must have. The village that fed on its neighbors reminds us that early agricultural societies were capable of organized violence on a scale that rivals anything associated with supposedly more primitive hunting bands, carried out not despite their sophistication, but very possibly because of it. Number 6. The people who filed their own teeth into fangs. The setting is prehistoric Japan, across the long span of the Jomon period, stretching from roughly 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, one of the longest continuous hunter-gatherer cultures documented anywhere in the archaeological record. A teenager sits still while an elder works carefully at their mouth with a stone abrasive tool, grinding the enamel of specific teeth down into sharpened points, or in some cases extracting entire teeth outright, one by one, over the course of what may have been a multi-year process tied to different life stages. By adulthood, the individual's smile looks nothing like the one they were born with. History remembers this practice as tooth ablation, and it appears in Jomon's skeletal remains with a consistency that makes clear it was never accidental. According to dental anthropologists who have studied thousands of Jomon skeletons recovered from shell mound sites across the Japanese archipelago, ablation and filing patterns follow structured, repeatable sequences, specific teeth removed or shaped at specific ages, differing somewhat by region and by sex. For a long time, this evidence was treated largely as a curiosity, an odd cosmetic custom, without much deeper significance attached to it. Surely something this widespread and this painful must have carried meaning beyond simple decoration, but without written records from a pre-literate culture, many assumed that meaning was permanently lost. Then researchers began cross-referencing ablation patterns with burial context, age at death, and grave goods, and a clearer picture started to emerge. Different combinations of removed or filed teeth appear to correlate with distinct life transitions. Evidence suggests connections to marriage, to mourning a close family member, and to broader passage into adulthood, each marked by its own particular dental modification. In some regions, filing certain teeth into sharp points may have carried an additional layer of meaning tied to status or group identity, a permanent, unmistakable marker that could not be removed, hidden, or faked. Unlike clothing or ornaments that might simply be borrowed, the physical process itself would have been agonizing by any modern standard, performed with ground stone tools against living nerve tissue, almost certainly without any effective pain relief beyond whatever plants or preparation rituals accompanied the procedure. And yet the practice persisted across the Jomon period for well over 10,000 years, one of the longest continuously documented body modification traditions anywhere in world prehistory, adapting its specific patterns over time while never disappearing entirely. What makes Jomon tooth ablation so difficult for a modern audience to process is not really the pain involved. Plenty of cultures across history have endured deliberate physical alteration for social meaning, tattooing, scarification, piercing among them. It is the permanence and the specific target, a part of the body, most people today associate almost entirely with health and function, deliberately damaged on purpose as a matter of course, expected of nearly everyone in the community, rather than reserved for a select few. The people who filed their own teeth remind us that the body has been treated as a canvas for identity and belonging for far longer, and in far more literal ways, than most modern assumptions about ancient life tend to account for. Number 5. The bog offerings who were killed more than once. The date is somewhere between roughly 400 BCE and 400 CE across the wetlands of Iron Age northern Europe, in territory spanning modern Denmark, Germany, Ireland, and the British Isles. A man is led, or possibly forced, into a peat bog at the edge of a settlement. What happens next, reconstructed centuries later from his own remarkably preserved body, involves not one method of death but several, layered on top of each other in a sequence too deliberate to explain as a single simple execution. History remembers these individuals collectively as bog bodies, and the sheer excess of violence inflicted on many of them has become one of the most debated puzzles in European archaeology. According to researchers who examined Lindo Man, discovered in an English peat bog in 1984, the body bore evidence of a blow to the skull, severe enough to cause fracturing, a ligature tightened around the neck sufficient to break a vertebra, and a deep cut across the throat. 3 distinct and independently fatal injuries inflicted on the same individual within a short span of time. For years, some scholars proposed that this pattern reflected ordinary Iron Age criminal punishment, a brutal but functionally simple execution whose forensic details had simply been misread by archaeologists unfamiliar with ancient combat injuries. Surely no community would deliberately kill the same person 3 separate times in succession without some very specific reason for doing so. Then comparative analysis across dozens of similarly preserved bog bodies, including Tollen Man in Denmark and Old Crogan Man in Ireland, revealed the same overkill pattern appearing again and again across different regions and different centuries, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or forensic misinterpretation. Many of these individuals also shared other unusual features: well-manicured hands suggesting they had not performed manual labor, stomach contents revealing a final meal notably different from ordinary daily fare, and careful, almost gentle placement of the body within the bog itself, arranged rather than dumped. Together, the evidence increasingly pointed away from punishment and toward ritual sacrifice. Ordinary people, often from privileged rather than marginalized backgrounds, selected and killed through an elaborate, multi-stage process that mattered as much as the death itself. Archaeologists studying the broader context of Iron Age Northern Europe note that bogs held a particular significance for these communities, liminal places, neither solid land nor open water, where valuable objects, weapons, cauldrons, jewelry, and gold were also routinely deposited as offerings and never retrieved. A human body placed in a bog, killed through an elaborate combination of blunt trauma, strangulation, and blade wounds, may have represented the same underlying logic taken to its most extreme expression. An offering deliberately made irretrievable, its value proven precisely by how thoroughly and irreversibly it was destroyed. What makes the bog bodies so hard to sit with is the layered deliberateness of it all. The sense that the killing itself was not the point so much as the ritual sequence surrounding it, each additional wound adding meaning rather than simply ensuring death. The bog offerings remind us that ancient sacrifice was rarely about efficiency. Sometimes the elaborate suffering built into the process was not incidental to the ritual. It was the ritual. Number 4, the hunters who drank from their enemies' skulls. The setting is Gough's Cave, in the Cheddar Gorge of southwestern England, approximately 14,700 years ago, near the very end of the last ice age. A small band of Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers shelters inside a limestone cave system among the earliest identifiable human groups to recolonize Britain after the retreat of the glaciers. Deep within the cave, alongside butchered animal bones and stone tools, lie the processed remains of at least 5 humans, adults and children, their bones bearing cut marks, deliberate fractures, and in several cases, skulls carefully and skillfully shaped into cups. History remembers this as one of the earliest and most technically sophisticated examples of prehistoric cannibalism ever documented in Europe. According to researchers at London's Natural History Museum, who conducted detailed microscopic analysis of the Gough's Cave remains, the cut marks on the human bones are functionally identical to those found on butchered deer and horse, remains from the same layer of the cave, following the same systematic pattern used to strip meat, extract marrow, and separate joints on ordinary game animals. For a long time after the remains were first excavated, in the early 20th century, the human bones were cataloged somewhat separately from this interpretation. treated as evidence of violence or unusual burial rather than food processing outright. Surely, some argued, a society sophisticated enough to produce finely worked tools and art would not have treated its own dead the same way it treated a hunted carcass. Then closer forensic comparison closed that gap entirely. Teeth marks matching human bite patterns were identified directly on some of the bones. The skull cups, meanwhile, revealed a level of craftsmanship that ruled out casual or hurried treatment. The facial bones and base of the skull carefully removed and trimmed, the remaining bowl-shaped structure smoothed along its broken edges, a process requiring real skill, patience, and almost certainly prior experience repeated more than once. Genetic and isotopic analysis of the individuals involved has since suggested they were closely related to the broader population occupying the cave, making it unlikely this represented warfare against outside enemies. The more widely supported interpretation today treats Gough's Cave as evidence of mortuary cannibalism, consumption of the dead as part of a structured funerary tradition, rather than an act of conquest or survival desperation. What makes this discovery so significant is its age. Occurring right at the tail end of the last ice age, Gough's Cave stands among the oldest confirmed examples anywhere in the world of cannibalism, practiced as a deliberate, skilled, repeated cultural tradition rather than a one-time act of crisis. The skull cups, in particular, suggest something beyond simple nutrition, an object crafted with clear intention, potentially used afterward as a drinking vessel or ceremonial item, transforming a human skull into something the community kept, handled, and likely valued long after the flesh itself was gone. What makes the hunters of Gough's Cave so difficult to fully absorb is not the act of cannibalism alone, but its craftsmanship, the evidence of skill, repetition, and apparent normalcy surrounding something a modern audience instinctively categorizes as the most extreme possible violation. The hunters who drank from skulls remind us that treating the dead this way did not require a society without art, without technical mastery, or without care. Gough's Cave had all three, and its people still chose to keep their dead exceptionally close. Number 3. The children led into the Sea of Mud. The date is approximately 1450 CE, on the desert coastline of what is now northern Peru, during a period of catastrophic flooding tied to a major El Niño event. Along a stretch of beach near the site now known as Juan Chiquito Las Lamas, more than 200 children, most between roughly 5 and 14 years old, are led out toward the shoreline alongside over 200 young llamas. What follows, reconstructed from the largest single episode of child sacrifice ever documented anywhere in the archaeological record, involved a scale of ritual killing that stunned even researchers accustomed to studying pre-Columbian sacrifice. History remembers the perpetrators as the Chimu, rulers of one of the largest kingdoms to exist in South America before the rise of the Inca. According to the bioarchaeologist Gabriel Prieto, who led the excavation team that uncovered the site beginning in 2011, the children's remains show a consistent pattern, a single deep cut across the sternum, likely intended to remove the heart, accompanied in many cases by evidence that the chest had been deliberately opened while the individual was still alive or very recently deceased. For years before this discovery, scholars studying Andean sacrifice generally assumed such practices, while documented among the later Inca in smaller, more isolated cases, could not have occurred on anything approaching this scale among earlier coastal cultures. Surely nothing this large or this systematically organized had taken place before European contact introduced its own catastrophic upheavals to the region. Then the excavation itself made the scale impossible to dismiss. Footprints preserved in the hardened mud around the burial site, left by both the child victims and the adults accompanying them, allowed researchers to reconstruct the actual procession that took place that day, showing the children walking toward the site under their own power rather than being carried or dragged, footprints leading only in one direction. Radiocarbon dating placed the event firmly within a documented period of severe flooding and coastal disruption, strongly suggesting the mass sacrifice was a direct response to catastrophic weather, an attempt to appease forces the Chimu believed controlled the rains and the sea, offering what their worldview considered the most valuable possible gift in exchange for the disaster's end. Isotope analysis of the children's diets further revealed they came from across the Chimu Kingdom, not exclusively from the immediate local area, suggesting the sacrifice was organized at a state level. Children gathered specifically for this purpose from distant communities under central authority rather than drawn only from families living nearby. The scale, coordination, and clear planning behind the event mark it as something closer to organized state religious policy than an isolated act of local desperation. A kingdom mobilizing its most vulnerable members in response to an environmental catastrophe threatening its entire population's survival. What makes Huanchaquito Las Llamas so difficult to process is not merely the number of children involved, though it remains the largest such event ever documented, but the apparent care embedded within the horror, evidence suggesting the children were dressed deliberately, accompanied, and led rather than seized by force. The children of the Sea of Mud remind us that some of history's most devastating acts of violence were not committed by societies that valued human life less than the modern world does, but by societies convinced that only the most precious offering imaginable could possibly be enough to stop a disaster already unfolding around them. Number 2. The Neanderthals, who broke open their own family's bones. The date is approximately 130,000 years ago, in a cave system at Krapina, in what is now Croatia, long before modern humans had ever set foot in Europe. A group of Neanderthals occupies the cave across multiple generations, leaving behind one of the largest collections of Neanderthal remains ever discovered at a single site, more than 800 bone fragments representing at least 20 individuals. Mixed among the discarded remains of deer, bear, and other game are human bones bearing precisely the same treatment, cut marks along major muscle attachments, deliberately fractured long bones, and skulls broken open in a manner consistent with brain removal. History remembers Krapina as one of the earliest and most extensively documented cases of Neanderthal cannibalism ever excavated. According to paleoanthropologists who have studied the Krapina collection since its initial excavation beginning in 1899, the cut marks on the Neanderthal bones are functionally indistinguishable from butchery marks, found on animal remains from the same layers of the cave, following identical patterns for meat removal and marrow extraction. For much of the 20th century, researchers actively resisted this interpretation, proposing instead that the damage resulted from cave bear activity, rockfall, or ritual secondary burial practices that simply disturbed the bones after death. Surely, many argued, Neanderthals, popularly imagined for decades as brutish and unsophisticated, could not have possessed the deliberate intent implied by systematic cannibalism, while the possibility that they might have practiced it for reasons other than simple starvation seemed even less credible. Then advances in forensic bone analysis during the late 20th and early 21st centuries allowed researchers to definitively rule out these alternative explanations. The specific pattern, location, and technique of the cut marks matched human-made stone tool damage rather than animal gnawing or geological disturbance. And crucially, the treatment of the Neanderthal remains proved statistically indistinguishable from the treatment applied to butchered red deer bones found in the same cave deposits. Whatever happened at Krapina, it was carried out with the same practice technique used on ordinary game, not a chaotic or desperate act, but a controlled and repeated one. What genuinely divides researchers today is not whether cannibalism occurred at Krapina. That conclusion is now widely accepted, but why? Some argue the evidence points towards simple survival cannibalism during periods of extreme food scarcity, a grim but pragmatic response to starvation among a small, isolated population. Others point to the careful, skilled nature of the cut marks and argue for a mortuary interpretation instead. Consumption of the dead as part of funerary tradition, not unlike the practices later identified at Britain's Gough's Cave tens of thousands of years afterward. Genetic evidence suggests the Krapina Neanderthals were a closely related, tightly knit group, making it more likely the individuals consumed were known members of the community rather than captured outsiders or enemies. What makes Krapina so significant is its age and its species. This was not modern Homo sapiens navigating a crisis. It was Neanderthals, a distinct human species that would not encounter modern humans for tens of thousands of years afterward, demonstrating the same capacity for structured, deliberate treatment of the dead that later shows up again and again throughout the human record. The Neanderthals of Krapina remind us that the impulse to consume the dead, whether from desperation or devotion, did not begin with our own species. It appears to be woven far deeper into the shared inheritance of the entire human family tree. Number 1. The ancestors who ate each other before humanity even existed. The date is somewhere between 800 and 900,000 years ago at a cave site called Gran Dolina, part of the Atapuerca Hills in northern Spain, so far back in time that modern humans, Neanderthals, and every other later human species had not yet evolved. A group of hominins belonging to the species Homo antecessor, one of the earliest known human relatives to inhabit Europe, occupies the cave across an unknown span of time. Among the discarded remains of horses, deer, and other prey animals lie the processed bones of at least 11 individuals of their own species, adults and children alike, bearing cut marks, fractures, and butchery patterns that match the surrounding animal remains almost exactly. History remembers Gran Dolina as containing the oldest confirmed direct evidence of cannibalism anywhere in the entire human evolutionary lineage. According to the paleoanthropologists at Spain's National Research Center on Human Evolution, who have led excavations at the site since the early 1990s, the human bones from Gran Dolina show cut marks concentrated in exactly the locations associated with efficient meat removal, evidence of skinning, disarticulation, and marrow extraction, indistinguishable in technique from the treatment applied to nearby animal carcasses. For years following the initial discovery in 1994, some researchers hesitated to draw firm conclusions from such an early and fragmentary sample, cautious about attributing complex behavior to a species so far removed from modern humans, so early in the broader human story that almost nothing was yet known for certain about their social lives or beliefs. Surely, some suggested, such ancient remains might reflect a single unusual event rather than any established pattern of behavior. Then continued excavation across multiple stratigraphic layers revealed the same treatment of human remains appearing repeatedly over an extended period, not confined to a single incident, but recurring across what researchers now interpret as a genuine, sustained pattern rather than an isolated anomaly. Detailed comparison confirmed that human bones were processed using the exact same techniques, the exact same tools, and left in the exact same discard locations as the remains of hunted game, suggesting these early hominins drew no meaningful behavioral distinction between consuming animal prey and consuming members of their own species. The proportion of juvenile remains among the victims has led some researchers to propose a particularly stark interpretation, that this may represent nutritional cannibalism practiced routinely, potentially even directed disproportionately against individuals from rival or unrelated groups encountered while competing for the same limited territory and resources, rather than ritual consumption of one's own dead community members. What makes Gran Dolina so profound is not simply its brutality, but its timing. This behavior predates not just modern humans, but every named human species that would eventually follow, occurring at a point in evolutionary history when the line between opportunistic predation and something resembling culture was still being drawn for the first time. Researchers studying the site increasingly frame the Gran Dolina cannibalism not as an aberration within an otherwise gentle evolutionary story, but as a genuine data point about the conditions early hominins faced: brutal competition for scarce resources in landscapes shared with other capable predators, and apparently, with each other. What makes the ancestors of Gran Dolina so difficult to fully absorb is the sheer distance across time. This was not a society, in any sense modern audiences would recognize the word. It was an early branch of the human family tree, hundreds of thousands of years before language as we understand it, before art, before anything resembling settled community life. And it was already capable of turning its own dead, and possibly its own living rivals, into a source of food processed with practiced, repeated skill. The ancestors who ate each other before humanity even existed remind us that some of the darkest chapters of the human story are not deviations from an otherwise peaceful evolutionary path. They may be among the very oldest parts of it, present almost from the beginning, long before there was anyone left alive to remember, mourn, or explain exactly why.